pleasures of this conference when David, John, me, and Mary were working together is any of you who've ever done conferences will know that you always come up with your A-team, sort of the people that you dream, saying, oh, wouldn't it be perfect if we could get all of these people? And so, you know, when the four of us were brainstorming, it was sort of like, okay, who are the names? What we are so happy about is, in fact, that we pretty well got everybody we wanted. And so this panel was very much part of the discussion, particularly David and John were saying, you know what, we need to get the discussions of those who've actually been engaged in the utilization of air power, those that have actually been at the front line. And we need to hear their voices. We need to hear their collective reflections upon why this is so important. And this is why we've given this, you know, in academic terms, we've given this panel a healthy amount of time, because this is such an important message that needs to get out. And so without further ado, I'm now going to hand it over to Rod Geisinger, who will be your chair for this session. Rod, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. And it feels like I'm coming home when I sit with Rob or Dr. Berkeson. It's really nice. It reminds me of the times we've spent in the CMSS and doing all kinds of group think. Remember Bob Miller around the table as well, and we used to have some great conversations. But really feel privileged to be here and to have a chance to share some of our collective experiences. I'm going to moderate. These guys are going to carry the water. These guys are the ones that really are going to share with you the experiences and the reflections that Dr. Hubert has so clearly mentioned. And it's beautiful to do it in the context of I love the term Gordian knot that our general described so eloquently earlier. So you've given us great landscape upon which to paint these pictures. One of the things this panel is going to introduce themselves, you got the bios out there, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But what I've asked them to do is to tell you one thing about themselves that's not in their bio, and also at least one thing about another member of the panel here. We've known each other for decades, so surely there's at least a bit of dirt out there somewhere. To share that with you as well. I've told them it is a public audience, so keep it clean. But let's, with that, I'm going to ask Bob Wade in a second to stand up and start that. Also, because we have a big chunk of time here, I don't want to push questions to the end. I'm going to stop at least twice and say, I can take 2 questions now, all right? And so that we can keep this engagement going. And feel free, if you need to get up and go, you don't need to hesitate, just go ahead and do it. So from that point of view, one thing about myself, grew up in inner city Edmonton and then moved to the farm out northwest of Edmonton as a farm boy. So I'm an inner city boy and a farm boy with nothing positive to say about either. The note I would mention about one other panel member who's probably going to get picked on a little bit here today is Hawnski. And that is, I've enjoyed many good products of his cooking. He's an excellent cook, especially of venison, and he's the only guy I know that can do a gourmet Caesar salad in a garbage bag. With that, Bobby, kick us off on introduction.
Thanks, Ron. I tell you how, when I was a kid, I grew up west of Edmonton. There was a horse ranching country. And one day, I was 16 years old, I think. I was out in this pasture trying to catch a horse. And I hear this roar over top of my head that changed my life. I was always going to be a doctor. I could name all 206 bones of the human body by the time I was 9 years old, you know. And what it was the Golden Hawks. They were going to do a show in Edmonton, and they were just off stage, you know, setting up for their show. And I was so impressed with that, I changed my whole intentions in life. I was now going to be a fighter pilot, and I had such a passion for it, I never got rid of that. And back in those days, you could join the Air Force at age 16 and become a fighter pilot, you know, and maybe that's not a bad thing. you know, because my dad drove me in the city. Back in those days, it was a gravel road into the city, and he drove me in. I went down to talk to recruiters, and a little while later, I wrote the exams. They sent me to Toronto for a crew selection, and I came back, and they said, we'll call you when we need you. But see, I was a kid without a grade 12 at that time. The Air Force said they'd give me my grade 12, and then I'd start pilot training. And that was a venture training program at that time, and quite a few of us did that. Hawnski, you do that? Not quite, yeah. Anyhow, what that meant is that I could be combat ready at 20 years of age. Nowadays, you've got to have a university degree. And how that degree helps you be a fighter pilot is beyond me, because they don't teach you the stuff you need to know when you're a fighter pilot. And so that it's something to consider going forward. You know, do we want to go back to those days of taking kids off the street? Now, they told me when I got my wings that, hey, you're never going to get promoted, but we'll keep you in the cockpit. I just said, thank you very much. You know, that's why I joined the Air Force, you know. And so that that's a bit of my background, a bit of my history that I think the Air Force needs to consider again that, hey, maybe these kids off the street aren't bad possibilities for future fighter pilots. Thank you.
Laurie, why don't you stand up?
Hello, everyone. Anyway, it's good to be back in my alma mater. You know, U of C saw fit to bestow a computer science degree on me in 1998 after I left the Air Force, so much appreciated. Anyway, I'm going to go into something that's not in my CV, but it has to do with my Air Force career, and that goes back to the new fighter aircraft evaluation. I happened to be selected as one of the 4-member flight selection team of we had 2 pilots and 2 engineers on it, other pilot being John Eakin. Anyway, the part there is that we got to fly all of the contenders, so it was probably one of the best 6 months of my life, and also the busiest 6 months. Because our MO was to fly one airplane for 2 weeks and then go home, go back to Cold Lake and write a report for 2 weeks. So if you do that for 6 months, it's didn't see too much of the wife and family. Anyway, I wanted to tell another little story also about in the Air Force, not previous to it, but it has to do with Hawnski sitting my right. Stinger said we'd probably pick on him quite a lot. There's a lot to pick on, actually. Anyway, this is not a pick-on story. When we stood up when the F-18s were introduced in Europe in the mid-1980s, we stood up the Air Division again. And that Air Division consisted of 3 F-18 squadrons in Baden, of course, and one Squadron 433 from Bagotville, and one Squadron 416 from Cold Lake. In 1989, Hawnski led his squadron over the Atlantic and landed in Lahr, and trained up his force. I think he was there, I think it was 4 weeks. But he trained up his pilots and to combat ready status in those 4 weeks. Same combat ready status that the pilots in the Air Division flew. And all that to say that he led those pilots in a fantastic way. They would have gone to hell and back for him. It's one of the best examples of squadron commandeering that I had seen in my Air Force career. So.
Here.
Deferential to my elders here. 2 things. Good morning, everyone. You can hear lots from me throughout the course of the day. 2 things. I'm clearly the youngest person in this panel. Each of these were superiors to me over the years. Bobby Wade was an instructor when I was on 410. My instructor was Laurie Hawn. Todd was the deputy commanding officer when I was still a captain overseas. And Ron Geidinger had the unfortunate job of being the wing commander when I was a squadron commander. The one thing you don't know, I am the one thing I'm known for, really, truly, all around the world. The single one thing I'm known for is Billie Flynn's fighter pilot Caesar salad. And I've done this for 40 years. And there are two rules: you can't change the name, and you can't cheat on the ingredients. And what the world doesn't know, like I made it in the Middle East, in India, in Hong Kong, really around the world, is that it's Laurie Hawn's Caesar salad recipe that I stole from him 40 years ago when I was a student on that first F-18 course.
Well, thanks, Billy. You finally acknowledged that. Actually, it was Mike McCarthy's Caesar salad, who was an American exchange officer at 417 back in the day, but he didn't get it quite right, so I had to change it a little bit. Anyway, this is a great audience, and as Dinger said, this is going to be picking on each other. It's going to be a target-rich environment. But I do want to tell you, that's not on my bio, a little thing about myself, and that's the derivative of the call sign Hawnski. And some of you may know part of the story, some of it is BS, but this is the real story. Came in off leave one day in Germany and went down to the squadron to see what was going on. We were doing a close air support exercise with the Belgian Army up north called Exercise Sky Blue. And one of the guys was sick, so Clancy Sheldrup, who was in the ops desk, said, "Do you want a trip?" I said, "Hell yeah." So I went through my gear on. And it was 9/11, well, 9/11, 1973. So I threw my gear on. He gave me the brief, said, "Here, take IP Orange," which a couple of these guys would know, which is a canned route. Take it to the end of the route, climb to 5,000, talk to the FAC, do what he says, and come home. So it was a beautiful day in Germany, which was unusual in those days. So I did that, climbed to 5,000, talked to the FAC, did a bunch of runs on Belgian armor. And then he said, "Exit the target area eastbound before turning south." What I didn't know was that the target was actually already inside the buffer zone, which is a 10-mile buffer this side of the political border. So I exited target area eastbound. I was going to do a rough point-to-point, which is a pilot term, back to the end of IP Orange. What I didn't know, because I hadn't been looking at it, was my INS had a terminal error of 090 for 150 miles. So it thought that Baden was somewhere in Czechoslovakia. And I was just motoring along. I was squawking. I wasn't hiding from anybody. I was looking for somebody to play with. And there was unusually no airplanes in the sky, because normally there's airplanes everywhere. So I motored for a while, couldn't find anybody. So I turned west, climbed to 20,000 feet, still squawking. And I tuned in the Frankfurt TACAN, and it said 070 for 90 miles. And I said, "Whoa, that's not where I thought I was." But nobody, we had folks monitoring traffic, and if you were going someplace you shouldn't, they would come up on guard and say, "Cedar Mine declares brass monkey, airplane doing da-da-da." And if you were there and you heard that and you didn't know exactly where you were, they might be talking to you. You turned 240, went like hell, and went home. And I said, there's a little part of the border, I must be down the corner, because somebody would have yelled at me. So I motored home at 20,000 feet. Coming by Frankfurt, these two American Phantoms bounced me. I said, the Americans weren't aggressive in those days. And now I was annoyed because I didn't have gas to play with them. So I just went to Mach 0.99 and did some big clearing turns, didn't see them, motor towards home. And as I'm turning into initial, something caught my eye, and a Phantom came out from underneath me up here. I said, And there was another one about 3 miles back. And I said, I wonder where 070 for 90 miles from Frankfurt really is. So I landed, went to the little board, and went, oh. There's a little place in then East Germany called Erfurt, and it was one of their big MiG-21 bases at the time, and I was basically in their traffic pattern, turning west. And so anyway, the poop hit the fan, and I was given a reproof for negligence in mission planning, which was true because I hadn't done any. For anybody that knows General Terrio out there, unless you have a PER with green ink from General Terrio, you haven't been trying hard enough. So I got some of that. The ironic thing was the two airplanes, because they all have tail flashes, the two airplanes that intercepted me were from Hawn Air Force Base. Spelled differently, but same name. The story didn't actually end there. 2 years later, I'm in Luke having a beer at the bar, shooting the poop with guys, talking to this guy named Jay Calloway. And he said, where you been? What have you done? Well, I was at Hawn flying F4s. I said, you didn't have to intercept a couple of A104. And he described what had happened. I said, yeah. I said, that was you? I said, yeah, that was me. He said, I told him you were German. I said, yeah, right. You're on my wing. Anyway, so that's where Hawnski came from. Now, just going back to got to talk about somebody else a little bit. Billie Flynn, who you're going to hear a lot from and about in the next hour or so. Yeah, Billie was my student. We got together, we're going to talk about F-35 later, but we got together often in Ottawa with his counterpart in Boeing, a guy named Ricardo Traven, who was a young pup on my squadron when I was CO. And we would have dinners, and of course, Billie was F-35, Ricardo was F-18 Super Hornet, and I had relationships with both of them. So we had a lot of dinners, and I basically sat back while they waved arms and yelled at each other and so on. But it was all in friendly fire. So anyway, that's there's some experience up here. I know all these guys from past days, and we're looking forward to the next little while. Thanks very much.
So now that you've had a chance to get to know these guys just a little bit, I'm going to ask them to just talk about their careers a little bit, some memories from back then. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think for the historians in the room particularly, this might reveal a few more things that you might want to talk about over a beer later on today. So Bob, you want to start us off again? And this is best times in the RCAF, worst times, most memorable characters, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I was lucky because I was just a kid when I joined the Air Force, and but there was no fighter postings, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and so that I became an instructor in Moose Jaw. But luckily, a couple of years after I was instructing, they started up the snowbird aerobatic team, and so that I joined the team as a young lieutenant. You can't do that anymore. But it was like being in a rock band. You know, you travel around North America in '74. We did 25 air shows in Newfoundland alone, you know. And that was because it was their 25th anniversary in Canada. And that sounds like it was a pretty good thing to do, but in reality, if you think about it, you're doing a show every day. And if you've ever been to Newfoundland, you know that they're going to squeeze you in every stop. And so, yeah, it was not a sobering experience. And if we had a crash coming out of there, we would have burned for 3 days. And then I finally got my 104 posting, and we went overseas. I flew 104s for 8 years, instructing on them, and then F-18s, and it was all really good stuff. I did lots of air show work in my day, and I had the opportunity to fly a MiG-29 in 1989, which was probably the most significant 30 minutes in my life, and it's been just a great career. So I'm hoping that kids get to experience that again when they join the Air Force and they have a career that they enjoyed as much as these guys here and myself. Thanks very much.
Well, I was a little different than Bobby. I was 17 in southern Quebec, grew up on a farm, and an Army recruiting officer came to the school and said he would pay me to go to school, and I said, to go to school to get an engineering degree, and I said, well, I'll sign up for that. So then the next question was, yeah, I had to sign up for an MOC, and I'm 17, didn't know a thing about the military or the Air Force, so having grown up rather poor, said, who makes the most money? And he said, well, other than doctors and lawyers, pilots. And I said, okay, I'll sign up to be a pilot. That's exactly how it happened. Then after a couple of years later, I got my first trip in a Chipmunk and said, that was the right decision. This is a really good thing to do. Anyway, I was in fighters my whole life, and the best times of life are pretty much in the cockpit. No doubt about that, except that first 2 years I was over in Germany, in Zweibrücken, doing the nuclear strike role. And then, of course, in 1970 or 1969, Zweibrücken closed, and we went to Lahr and as a strike squadron, and we were the only strike squadron in Lahr. So guess what? They gave us all our own airplane squadron maintenance. We had one MARG all to ourselves, and airplanes, that serviceability was just fantastic. So we pretty much could go out and fly 2 or 3 trips a day, pretty much every day. So as a squadron, as a pilot, that was probably my best year. The characters that we came across, we had a time that we were following the lead of Sammy Firth, who was the squadron commander in Cold Lake at 417 Squadron. The occasion was Prince Philip was coming to Baden in 1973 to present all of the 3 squadrons there with their colors, which he did. So anyway, Sammy Firth from Cold Lake was enlisted to go over and lead a 36-plane flyby for that presentation. So we practiced it up, and the day before we did a perfect practice. Everything went tickety-boo, and we crossed the parade square right on time. On the day of the presentation, we headed out into France, turned around, came back in, and all of a sudden, Sammy says, "Oops, we're a minute early." So with 36 airplanes, he says, "Okay, we're going to do a little zig." So he goes 90 degrees to the left. And then he says, "Okay, now we're zagging back 90 degrees to the right, cross the run-in line, and then back to the left, roll out about 5 or 10 miles back, went across the parade square, bang on time. The picture of the formation looks absolutely perfect." So from that time on, he was called Sammy Zigzag. So that's one of the, there's a lot of characters, but that was one of my favorite. And by the way, he was an outstanding squadron commander as well. So I have a picture of that formation in this book by Dave Bashell, actually, called Starfighters. So anyway, that's a bit of some of my history.
Thank you,
So a couple things. I grew up in the military. My mom was a corporal. My dad was a flight lieutenant. They got married in the church in Baden-Soligan. Back in the day, a non-commissioned member couldn't be married to an officer, so my mom had to get out of the military. And I grew up on fighter bases. All I've ever known my whole life is the Canadian Air Force. And the deputy commander and I share something because our fathers flew, as it turns out, Voodoos together in Bagotville, Quebec. And I remember coming out of church on Sundays, my dad taking us to the hangar, my brother and I sitting in the cockpits of Voodoos playing away. And that's really the spark for me, that all I've ever known is the Air Force, and it led in the path that I've lived. And I was the first of many parts of the revolution that started 40 years ago in the CF-18. I was the first pipeliner, which as a kid, I was picked out of pilot training even before, or as I graduated, told I'd be the first kid. And we led a wave, and I lived a wave of firsts in the Hornet. First pipeliner solo, first live intercept, first kid sent off the coast of Gander, Newfoundland to chase your Russian bear, first deployment overseas, and it just went on and on and on. And just a wave, and when you're a kid, you just hang on for dear life because this is the greatest adventure of all time, and it's why I'm so passionate about this Air Force. I'll tell 2 stories though. There's a phrase that's often used, the honor and a privilege. A bunch of us have commanded before. 25 years ago in Operation Allied Force, I had the honor and privilege of commanding the Canadian force that fought over Kosovo and Serbia in Operation Allied Force. And it is one of those times in your life that changes you forever, and getting to witness what is truly the courage and the professionalism of what the RCAF, the men and women, both the aviators and the technicians, are all about. Honor and a privilege. The second part, I want to come back to something Hawnski said. So I'm for many years, the Lockheed Martin spokesman for F-35, and the competition that would never end was here in Canada, really, and we're going to talk about that saga a bunch over the course of the day. And I'm the spokesman. And my counterpart is the Boeing chief test pilot for the Super Hornet, Ricardo Traven, also same background as I am, Canadian, who ends up for the Boeing company down south. And we go to trade shows, and we go to air shows like Abbotsford, and it's me against him everywhere in the public and with the press. And CANSEC is the big military trade show every year. It's the end of May. It's in Ottawa, right near the airport. And we all got to go, because back in the day, Boeing's full on against Lockheed Martin, and we're all fighting it out for ultimately what was a $19 billion contract that we won. But what the world doesn't know
is that Ricardo, Traven, and I lived together in the same house at Patuxent River. And we are arch enemies out in public, and we are best friends, roommates at home. And when we moved together, I had to go to the Lockheed security people, because I've got a special access program, black clearance, and he's got the equivalent of Boeing. And I have to say to them, the enemy is living across the hall from me in our house. Is this okay? And the basic rule says, don't talk about your airplane with him. And he didn't want to hear anything about the F-35 anyway. But we're living together, and nobody, and I do mean nobody, knows it, except for the two of us and the two security guys. So we're at CanSec, and I know he's there, but I get a text in the morning, and there's a bunch of us have been to it. Big breakfast, there's like 700 people. There's a keynote address, which is typically some politician, senior military official. And I get a text, and he goes, hey, we need to talk. So I pop up wearing a blue Lockheed flight suit, embroidered, and the other side of the room, this guy stands up, big tall man, blue flight suit with Boeing all over it, and we rush together in the middle. And 698 people think there's going to be a Donnybrook in the middle of CanSec while the Boeing guy's taking on a Lockheed thing. And we come together, and he looks at me and goes, dude, I'm so sorry, I forgot to take out the garbage before I left. And then he goes, you're going to be home before me Friday, can you pick up some steaks? And everybody thinks there's a big fight. Meanwhile, nobody knows that we're roommates and we've been together for a couple of years living together. That's what I am.
Those are great, Billy. A few things along the same lines. What prompted me to join the Air Force? I grew up in Winnipeg. We spent the summers on Lake Winnipeg. And, every 2 or 3 times every summer, a T-bird or occasionally a saber would come ripping down the beach at the speed of heat and lowering a snake's belly. And I said, we got to do that. Now, I didn't find out till several years later that not everybody was amused when I did that. And I spent 2 weeks orderly officer for the privilege. But that's another story. We're talking about best times in the RCF, and mine was the squadron life, the mess life, which you're not allowed to do anymore. That's another story. And the folks that we did it with, the flying, obviously, I flew nonstop. I had many ground jobs. Every ground job I had, I was current on 2 airplane types, either the 104 in the T-bird or the F-18 in the T-bird. I had 114 months in ground jobs, and I averaged 17 hours a month over that period of time in my ground jobs. So you want to give me a ground job? Sure, I'll take another one. It was the people. There was a threesome called Rackham, Bagshaw, and Hawn, and we were running mates. And we struck terror into the hearts of more than one senior officer over the years. Unfortunately, we lost Paul Rackham in Norway in a 104. My biggest disappointment was missing Gulf War I. On the 19th of August, I gave up command of 416 Squadron. On the 19th of July, on the 2nd of August, Saddam invaded Kuwait. And I picked up a newspaper coming out of Vancouver, saw that, and I was, pardon the expression, pissed. Because I knew that 416 was going to go, and I knew that I wasn't going to go because I wasn't the freaking CO anymore, and some other guy took my place. No names, no pack drill, but I've forgiven him for that. Dinger did a great job. Memorable characters, there are 3 that stand out for me. I was going through pilot training in Gimli in the mid-60s, and we had World War II guys who were honorary members of the mess, and they would come and buy us young pups beers and tell us war stories, so it was win-win. And this one old guy didn't have a hair in his head anywhere. He was telling me war stories about Bomber Command. And he was talking about this particular mission in 1944, being shot down over France, and surviving, and what an experience that was. And his name was Pat Brophy. He was Andrew Minarski's tail gunner. For those that know the Andrew Minarski story, and you're at an Air Force event, so you should. So I appreciate it more today than I did on that day, but holy cow, that was the guy that got Andrew Minarski his Victoria Cross. And I've used that at a lot of Remembrance Day events. And my point of that is how many other Victoria Crosses were earned but never awarded because nobody lived to tell the story. And you got to know there's a bunch. The second guy is a guy named Andy McKenzie, who I met overseas and then a number of times in Ottawa. He's the only fighter pilot I know who's been shot down by friendly fire in 2 different wars. He was shot down in a Spitfire by American AAA in World War II. And later in Korea, he was one of the 22, 23 Canadians flying over there. He was shot down by his American wingman in another Sabre. And he spent 2 years as a guest to the Chinese until Lester Pearson actually managed to get him out. He said he landed from that, and the Chi-Coms were coming up the hill at him. He said, I pulled out my 9mm, I looked at it, I looked at them, I looked at it, I looked at them. He said, I threw it down and went down to see what they wanted. And what they wanted, of course, was to give them room and board. So, you know, the Air Force is about for me, great careers, great flying, great postings, great people, and the characters you meet along the way. Besides these 4 characters, the Air Force is rich in these characters, and the newer, younger, way better looking characters coming up are carrying on that tradition. And I thank you, General, for that, and I thank all of you folks for carrying on and supporting the Air Force tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Hawnski. Geez, shot down, friendly fire, 2 different wars. That's buzzard luck if I ever heard it. Any questions out there in the audience? Yeah, there's one over there, and then one here in the front, and then we'll cut it right there.
Towards the end of the Cold War, 1989, the Soviet Union was going broke, and so they decided they wanted to market their MiG-29 to the Western world. They demonstrated the air show in Paris in June of 1989 and crashed. And there's some remarkable pictures out there from that crash. Their next show was going to be in Abbotsford, BC. I was in charge of the alert forces for Western Canada at that time. And so when the 2 MiG-29s were going to transit through Alaska, going down towards Abbotsford, I had 2 birds on alert. I actually took 3 birds when they scrambled me, and we were to do the escort through Canadian airspace until they came into Abbotsford. And so they scrambled me on the appropriate time. I came in, intercepted the 2 MiG-29s, and then NORAD had told me I was to go no closer than 1,000 feet and to make no attempt to communicate with the MiG-29s. That's fine. I had no ambition, but we were sure interested in seeing them. We'd only had intelligence briefs on them prior to that. And then after about 20 minutes of flight, I can see that these boys are headed about 40 degrees right of track. And so I called up NORAD and said, hey, where are these guys headed? NORAD says, we have no idea. And so then on my other radio, I went over to Vancouver Centre and asked them the same thing. And Vancouver Centre's getting pretty excited and said, hey, listen, we can see this whole gaggle of airplanes headed south, but we haven't talked to anybody. So I flew up beside the MiG-29 despite the regulations, and the guy's pointing at his headset, give me a thumbs down, and he's saying, hey, I've got a radio failure. Okay, and so I pointed at him. I pointed about 40 degrees left, he turned, and then I asked him how much fuel he had on board. You do that with a drinking motion with your hand. He holds up 3 fingers. And that means he's got 30 minutes of fuel on board. And I'm looking at my instruments, and they're saying, hey, we're 30 minutes plus out of Abbotsford. So what I decided to do is I just tapped my shoulder. They joined up and flew formation on my wing. I put my 2 F-18s on my left wing. We went through 30,000 feet of cloud. And those boys did a remarkable job. Now, they were test pilots. I didn't know if they were fighter pilots that could fly formation like that, but they did. They did a remarkable job. And so I dropped them off in Abbotsford. I wanted to stop there and talk to them, but I couldn't because I was armed. And so I go back to put the aircraft on alert in Comox. And when I shut the engines down, the crew chief comes up the ladder and he says, Mage, he says, that phone's been ringing off the wall for you. And I said, no kidding, that'd be Commander NORAD being happy with all the rules I just broke. But when I got into the crew room, the phone rang and I answered it, and it wasn't NORAD at all. It was the Soviet embassy, and they just wanted to thank me for helping them out. And I said, that's no problem. And they asked me to be their guest when I went over to the Abbotsford Air Show, and I was taking 2 jets over there anyhow, so I said, sure. And I did that, and I figured, well, if I'm going to be their guest, I'll go over to their pavilion and tell them who I am. I did that on a Friday, and the guard goes in, comes back out, he says, you have to go away. And same thing on Saturday. And what was the problem was that they were really unhappy that they wanted to have one of their pilots fly either the F-15 or the F-18, and in return, they would allow a Western pilot to fly the MiG-29. And the American government says, no way, you're not getting near any of our jets. And so they were pretty disappointed in that. And then finally on the Sunday, they decided to allow a Western pilot to fly that MiG-29 without a reciprocal agreement. And so that the two-star that was there, two-star general, God, I wish I could remember his name. Anyhow, he came over to me and asked me if I'd do it. And I said, sure, I'd do that. And Mary Collins, who was the Associate Deputy Minister of Defense, was there at the same time at that air show. It was a big deal to have the Russians. And as I was strapping my G-suit and helmet wouldn't fit the MiG cockpit, so that I was strapping into Romeo's G-suit. Romeo's about that high and about that wide. So his G-suit didn't fit too good. His helmet, I could spin on my head, you know. But it doesn't really matter because I'm going to fly this MiG-29. And they showed me how to start the jet. And all the instruments are in Cyrillic, so I couldn't read any of them, none of them. Valerie Miniski was my rear seater. He was going to sit in the rear seat. And in the rear seat of the MiG-29, you can't see forward. You've got a periscope up there. And he doesn't speak a word of English. So they taught Valerie to say Bob pilot or Valerie pilot. That seemed good to me. And so that we taxied out, and Valerie's taxiing it out, and then he says, Bob pilot. Good. You're going to let me take off. I have no idea what takeoff speeds, flap speed, gear speed, or any of that stuff is, but I'd watched the air show and I'd seen them about how much runway they used, and so I just go for it. And then when I was doing the air show on the F-18, I would do a takeoff loop. Well, I go through the vertical on the F-18, the airspeed would roll back a few knots or, you know, it'd stagnate. On the MiG-29, it accelerated right through the vertical. So I know he had better thrust to weight, but what I didn't know was how much fuel he had on board. How heavy was this airplane? You know, I couldn't make any assessment because I couldn't read any of the instruments. And so I hard maneuvered the airplane for a little while, and Valerie never said anything, and he says, Valerie pilot. And about 2,500 feet above the ground, he takes the airplane into the vertical, he pulls both throttles to idle, and the airplane stops going up and starts into a tail slide. Now, if you're in an F-18 and you do that, it takes you 5,000 or 6,000 feet to get that nose back down and fly out of it. As soon as Valerie selected both afterburners, that airplane stopped going down and just flew right out of it. So I was saying Bob pilot a lot right there. And so, yeah, he said, yeah, Bob pilot. So I did the same thing, except I didn't allow the nose to drop. I held it about 70 degrees nose up, and I just could rudder it back and forth in both directions. I just wanted to see how good a gunfighter this thing really was, you know. How much maneuverability did it have at 70 Alpha? And I was really impressed with it. So that Valerie says landing or something like that. And so I took the airplane back in and landed it. Again, no idea what speeds were, but Valerie never said anything, so I guess that was about right. And then they wouldn't let me talk to the media when I landed, so they took me back over to the Soviet pavilion. And so we toasted the Soviet Union, and they give you a tumbler about half full of vodka, maybe 2 or 3 ounces, and they all chugged it. So yeah, I'm a fighter pilot, I'll chug that. And then we toasted Mikoyan, the MiG company, drank that one down. My ears were starting to ring and my tongue's tingling. And then they toasted me, so I got to drink to that. So that's 3 shots of about 2 or 3 ounces within less than a minute. Anyhow, they invited me to leave. I don't know whether I was misbehaving or singing too loud, but anyhow, I go outside, the media is everywhere, want to interview. And you could see that on YouTube for a long time. And I think it's funny, but I guess a lot of people didn't. And that was my experience. So the next year I spent traveling around NATO as a 30-minute expert on a MiG-29. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. You say it like nobody else can. We had a question here.
My question is, If you go back to 401 flying Spitfires in the Second World War, or you guys flying F-104s or Hornets or whatever, it seems to me that there's a direct correlation between what pilots needed to know and how they flew, despite the difference in technology. But now when you're talking about F-35s, it seems to me that it's now something of a different ball game, potentially because the £100,000 helmet, never mind the airplane, might even be, pardon me, smarter than the pilot. So is that correct, or is today's fighter pilot no different from the Spitfire comrade 80 years ago?
Billie, why don't you kick that off, and others can chime in after.
Well, it's a significant evolution. Really, we're going to talk about a revolution of what a fighter pilot's skill is, right? And so go back to World War II, but go back to all the series of generations of jet pilots up until this point, where it really was flying skills. And then we get into third-gen airplanes, which is really the F4, and us in fourth-gen, where now we're managing multi-roles, not single tasks for a pilot, and we're managing screens, and we're dealing with pilot workload. And we reach some end point where we overwhelm the pilot, and we know the stories because it killed our course mates and our squadron mates over the years when they were overloaded with what was in the cockpit and they couldn't manage it all. And we've evolved. And it's part of it's stealth, but a lot of it is the term sensor fusion, where we introduce, it's not AI necessarily, but we have the airplane decide what's important or not. And my only task anymore is just managing what's on that screen and take the pilot out of the equation and let the system do it for it. And oh, by the way, we get airplanes that are magically easier to fly. You've flown more than me, but in my 80 airplanes that I ever flew, by far the F-35 is the easiest to fly. That is not my task. My task is to manage what's on those screens. Do I still need pilot skills? Absolutely. Do I need to spend my time flying? Absolutely not. You can't see me. That's a stealth platform out there. Not invisible. Forget what Donald Trump says. You're not invisible. But you're hard to detect, and we manage all that. But I can see everything, and you can't see me. My task is to manage everything on there. Next generation does it better than I did. And my task isn't flying an airplane anymore. Do you still need what is in the heart of every warrior, every fighter pilot in history? The courage in combat, the decision-making that comes from our ancestors through the generations, all those pilots before us? Absolutely. Do you still need to breed or grow not war fighters, but warriors? Absolutely. Is there a threat out there that's going to kill people? Well, there's Vladimir Putin, we know. There is a China threat that if a Taiwan Straits crisis opens up, China will outnumber us 4-1. And so they have very real threats. The backbone of what a fighter pilot is, how to create a warrior ultimately, still is in the DNA that I see in the fighter pilots that are out there today. Do I need to be a great aviator anymore? No. But then I'll come back to one thing, and I'm going to pick on fighter lead-in training later, complement what the deputy commander talked about, and we're going to address this. It's as lethal, as effective as these young kids are in $100 million airplanes wearing a $400,000 US, 1.4 to the Canadian dollar now, $400,000 US helmet, as lethal as they are, the one thing that we now know was missing in their training is basic flying skills and airmanship at the heart of what Canadian pilots always had. And we thought it all evaporated because of the magic out there of a $100 million airplane. And at the heart of what they need now, and it's been reinforced in the last couple of years, is basic flying skills and decision making.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Those kind of questions are the essence of this next discussion. So it's about Central Europe, F-104, high accident rate, relinquishment of the nuclear strike role, which I think many Canadians would never even have thought we had, and the disbandment in 1994 of our 3 F-18 squadrons in Central Europe and its impact on the RCAF. So to start us off, Gord, can you start up, and then Bob and Hawnski to finish up.
Thanks, Ron. Todd talking about the 104 loss rate, I just thought I'd go through a few statistics. From 1962 to 1972, we lost 76 airplanes and 23 pilots. And that was with a total flight time of 330,400 hours. All works out to a loss rate of about 2.2 per 10,000 flight hours. Once we got to the conventional era, 1972 to 1986, we lost 37 airplanes and 14 pilots, flying a total number of hours, 246,700. That works out to a loss rate of about 1.4 per 10,000 hours. So, as you can see, as the program matured, the loss rates went down. Now, we started out to talk about the excessive loss rates of the 104. I submit that those numbers aren't necessarily that excessive. So the reputation I got as a widowmaker and a few other nasty names aren't really valid names for the 104 in my view. Anyway, I'll leave you with that question: is that excessive or not? Now, I'll compare it with the F-86, which we replaced. The F-86, I don't have the number of hours they flew, but they flew it was around 12 years. They lost 282 airplanes, and depending on the numbers you read, either 107 pilots, as we say at our Cold War exhibit, or another number I've read is 112. But anyway, compared to the 104, seems to be a bit more. Now, the causes for all those losses in the 104 especially, the mission was high speed, low level, in crappy weather. And when I say crappy weather, the weather in the 60s in Germany was excessively crappy because of all of the CO2 spewing out of plants scattered around Germany. So I can recall many times we'd take off at a half a mile to a mile viz, pop into the cloud, fly around for an hour at 800 to 1,000 feet using a radar for navigation, come back and land off a GCA with still 0.5 mile viz. We did that routinely. So if you can appreciate the workload that's entailed navigating using the radar in cloud in that way, you can appreciate that there's not much room for error. So we lost guys running into the ground, running into hills. The other factor, of course, is single engine versus dual two engine. That argument or that debate's been going on forever. We had it with the F-18, we've had it with the F-35, and we had a single engine. It was a good engine, and I've always said I'd rather have one good engine than two bad ones, which some airplanes have had, but it's still a single engine, and we lost airplanes because of birds, a number of bird strikes. We had main fuel control unit failures, which is one I had to eject out of because of that. We had in the early days nozzle failures, which caused the airplane not to have enough thrust to make it back to home base. That, in fact, was fixed early on in the program with something called the emergency nozzle closure system, and of course compressor stalls. I was thinking of bird strikes. I remember we had one person came back from pulling off a target and actually hit the trees, but he attributed a bird strike. We said, well, yeah, hitting a bird that's sitting in a tree doesn't count. And then there was other aircraft malfunctions. We've talked about Paul Rackham, who died up in Bodø in Norway. That was an aircraft malfunction, I believe, although maybe Laurie can confirm it, but it was a leading edge flap that came off the airplane. And another malfunction we had was my course mate doing a final turn to land in Baden, and something called the Cadillac valve in the tail seized up, so he had no pitch control, and he did not have time to eject out of the airplane. So anyway, that's a little bit of talk about loss rates. Now the nuclear role, of course, did that from 1964 to 1972, or end of 1971. And we started out with 6 strike squadrons, and then in 1968, 67 and 68, we whittled that down to 4 strike squadrons, and then 1970, we whittled that down to 3. Now, just to get a get an idea of what the potential force that we had with those squadrons. Oh, by the way, we used to set 2 airplanes on a 15-minute alert at all times with either a B-28 or a B-57 nuclear weapon strapped on the airplane. We had 15 minutes to launch. Of course, Canada didn't control the weapons until war was declared, and we got our 4-digit PAL code that we would plug into the weapon, which would allow us to take control and arm it. And as the Cold War name suggests, we never had to do that, so thank God. But our normal TACAVLs in Europe at the time were conducted at least once a year by either AFC headquarters or 4-8TAF headquarters. I can't remember which one it was, but they'd come down in the middle of the night or late early morning and tell your security that the base was on TACAVL from that time on. And once they hit the front gate, then we had either 12 or 24 hours, also I can't remember which, but we had that amount of time to get 70% of our airplanes loaded with nuclear weapons. Now, if you could compute that all out, with about 18 aircraft per squadron, which I think what we had, that would be, with 6 squadrons, 75 airplanes out on the line loaded with nuclear weapons, or 50 with 4 squadrons, or 37 with 3 squadrons as we finished up. Now, that, when you consider the amount of force that's loaded on those airplanes, even 37 airplanes is still a significant amount of destructive power that was pointed at Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany. And in my opinion, and probably a lot of others, in our TACAVLs, we always got 1s across the board, which is the highest mark you could get. So we were probably the most effective strike force that SACEUR actually had. And when we decided to go conventional, do you think SACEUR was happy to see that force leave his control? I don't think so. And I think that cost us a lot of prestige. Now, we went to 3 squadrons dropping conventional weapons. The pilots in those squadrons were outstandingly good, as Canadian pilots have always been. But the aircraft is not, the 104 was not ideally suited for conventional weapons, in that it didn't carry a lot. And because of the high wing loading, it wasn't as agile close to the ground as a lot of other airplanes were. So, now this segs right into the F-18. We started deploying, I've already talked about the stand-up of the Air Division. As we segged into the F-18, we reconstituted the Air Division because all of a sudden we had 5 squadrons that were tasked for wartime duties in Central Europe. Previous to that, we'd had 2 F-5 squadrons tasked to the northern flank, and they used to go over and practice out of Norway. But once we got the 5 squadrons tasked to Central Europe, then the Air Division stood back up. So the F-18s were stood up in Baden, and Lahr was a deployment base for the 2 squadrons coming from Canada. In 1989, the Air Division was probably the most prepared for war that it had ever been. We had every F-18 was situated in a hardened aircraft shelter. We had PPE biosuits for the pilots to fly in the F-18s. So chemical warfare was not a huge issue. We even had finally an air defense regiment that protected our airfields with both missiles and guns. Now, all the time before that we've been in Germany, we did not have any protection for our airfields. So we were as effective a unit as you could have. Now, it was a small 5-squadron force, but extremely effective, and our prestige, I think, had gone up quite a bit at that point because of this force that SACEUR had under his control. The last TACAVL, in 1989, we got TACAVL at both air-to-air and air-to-ground. And once again, we got 1s across the board and air-to-ground. And I can't remember, maybe Billie can correct that. I don't remember if we got 1s or 2s in air-to-air, but we were TACAVL in both and passed them both with flying colors. So we're gung-ho, ready to go, and guess what? November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the world changed big time. Over the next 3 or 4 years, we dismantled all that we had there, and then, of course, in 93 and 94, we brought all our forces back home to Canada. So, to me, bringing the forces back from Europe, there's a distinct difference now than there was then, because then we had two major roles. We had NATO and we had NORAD. And NATO was one of the prizes everybody wanted, because you go to live in Germany for 3 years. It was I think, a big recruiting factor, that you require to recruit fighter pilots in, you and your family have a good chance of heading over to Germany. So that no longer exists. We have basically the NORAD role, although we do a lot of deployments to Europe and other places, we're not physically there. And of course, we've also lost the German bases as forwarding locations, such as was done for the Gulf War in 1991. Anyway, that brings me to the end of my talk, I think, at this point, and we can turn it over to Laurie and Bob if they have further things to say.
Yeah, Bobby, why don't you give us a quick look? We're starting to get to time.
Quick. Thank you. I flew for 39 years. If I had to go back and fly any jet, it'd be that Starfighter. That was the most fun. And when Trudeau took us out of this boy's daddy, he's just as bad as this guy, but he took us out of that nuclear strike role where the airplane was really good at, and made us go conventional ground attack. It created huge problems because the wings are so small on that Starfighter, we could only carry 4 bombs. Sometimes I'd have to take up to 12 aircraft just to get enough weapons onto a target to make that mission worthwhile. We had to be able to hit a target plus or minus 3 seconds. We're navigating off a hand-drawn map. Okay, so when NATO gives you a target, you go to mission planner and you put that target on a map, then you draw your routing back to your takeoff point, and that's what you fly. Once you're in the air, there's no communications between any of the aircraft, okay? You're briefed as to what you're gonna do and what times you gotta make good. If you're late, they're gonna frag another section in behind you 30 seconds later. If you're late, you're gonna take them out because your weapons will still have shrapnel in the air. Okay, so it was a very demanding job. But we were so good at it, and that's what made it fun. You have a lot of self-satisfaction in doing that stuff. Accidents, yeah. The Germans, the Danes, the Dutch, Belgians, they all flew the Starfighter, but everybody did their low flying in West Germany. And that was because you get noise complaints in your own country, so you go over to West Germany and make noise, okay? Everybody had about the same accident rates, and so that they used to say, if you want to have your own Starfighter, you move to West Germany, you buy an acre of land, and you wait. One was coming in, so that there was a lot of accidents, but it wasn't, I never had any fear of that airplane. Okay, there were pilot error, a lot of stuff that were fatalities, but the other stuff were just aircraft systems failures, bird strikes. Okay, that's it. Hawnski.
Thanks, Bobby and Gord. I'll just add a couple of points to that. On the accident side, of the 37 pilots that died, 33, only 4 were as a result of the aircraft. The other 33 were what the pilot did. And anybody who's flown the airplane, we've all come close to dying a time or two, and as Gordon said, always lowest level, always high speed, always crappy weather, hilly terrain. It didn't take much to come face to face with terra firma. And we've all had the stick buried in our lap from time to time saying, I hope this works. And it did for us, because we're here. For some people, it didn't. And a lot of reasons. The weather, the environment, of course. But the other one was the airplane had, relatively speaking, limited aids compared to airplanes now. And when you're flying along at radar, you're trying to press the weather when you're VFR, and if you're not looking at your radar, and the radar starting to go black from top to bottom, it means the radar can't see through what's in front of you. And guess what? If the radar can't see through it, you can't fly through it. And a lot of guys died with black radar scopes because and for my personal practice, I wanted to see we were low level, below crappy weather all the time. And I wanted to see not necessarily the horizon, but I wanted to see a horizon. The next array of hills, for example, I wanted to see that horizon. When I got to that horizon, I wanted to see the next one. If I couldn't see the next one, then it was time to do this before my radar turned black. And, you know, we survived. Gord brought up Paul Rackham's accident in Norway, and that's always bothered me. And Rackham and I were running mates along with a guy named John Bagshaw, who these guys all know. And Bud Burnson was behind Paul, and they're in Norway at Bodø, and they were turning final, and Racker's turned final, and all of a sudden his airplane did a rapid roll and pitched nose down. He pulled the handles, but he got partway up the rails when the airplane hit the water, and it went into deep water, and they wrote it off as pilot error, that he just pitched the airplane up. And all of us who knew him said, no, that's not true. But that's the way it was written up. And then, I forget the tech rep's name, but he didn't like that answer. Yes, no, it wasn't Clive. And anyway, they said there's something wrong with that. So they went down, got a submersible or something, went down to have a look at the wreckage, and the flap, the trailing edge flap on the right wing, you could have put it on another airplane. The trailing edge flap on the left wing was completely gone, which suggested that what the airplane did was there was a lot of lift on the left wing and nothing on the right wing, and that's the way the airplane behaved. And what had happened was a flap actuator had failed. In the Starfighter, if you get a flap asymmetry, you can't move the flaps anymore. Now, he wouldn't have had time to diagnose that anyway, but he had one full flap down with bounded air control, which gives even more lift, and one flap up. So he was killed at that point. Now, I don't think they ever changed the official findings of the accident board, and that's what really annoyed the hell out of me, because they never did that. Now, maybe that's been a sore point for a while with me. Favorite airplane, 104, hands down, along with these guys. F-18, way more capable. F-104, so much fun to fly. If you could get the gear up in Cold Lake in a 40 below day with a clean airplane, if you could get the gear up without overspeeding it, which you had to lie to the weight on wheel switch to do that, you could be supersonic at the end of the runway. You're going through about 630 knots, so it's coming out of burner time until you made some really expensive tinkling noises, and then people get angry when you did that. So no, it was a wonderful airplane. It was an honest airplane. You had to respect the flight envelope. If you didn't, you got in trouble. But it was a great airplane. I wouldn't trade that. If you parked them side by side with an F-18, I'd get the 104 every time. Not to go to war in. F-18 was way more capable, but just for the satisfaction of fun of flying it. And that's what the Air Force is all about. When it comes down to it, is we do serious jobs, but it's got to be fun. And I had nothing but fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie and Bob and Gordy, on really good insight on the 104 and the transitions we all experienced. I'd like to move now to what I think may be our most important topic here, and that is how we view the future of the RCAF and some of the, tangents. The attempted purchase of the F-35 during the Harper years. I mean, given the growing pains of being an early purchaser, is it an advantage or a disadvantage to have delayed? I mean, that was alluded to by the Deputy Commander here earlier. Is there a need for fighter squadron reserves, or maybe other reserves for other squadrons? That was a concept in play for a time. It went away, flamed out as we've heard. So let's let Laurie kick us off here and give us his perspectives from not just in the Air Force. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Ron. And I was part of the F-35 program from the political side when I was in Ottawa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that time and then hand it off to Billie for the more current stuff. And you can't cover this story in a couple of minutes because it was a big story full of controversy. We joined the Joint Strike Fighter program in 1997 under the Liberal government. It was the right thing to do. And that wasn't a commitment to buy, but there was an implied expectation that down the road you would. That program was way different than the new fighter aircraft program that I was intimately involved in from the start as well. And the big part of that was the industrial benefits program. With the F-18 program, it was dollar for dollar. If we spent $3 billion, they had to give us $3 billion in industrial benefits. The program for the Joint Strike Fighter was not written the same way. And a lot of people in Canada couldn't get their heads around that. It was based on a competitive basis. Canadian industry, or industry in any country, was given the opportunity to compete for contracts. Canadian industry did extremely well. Grosso modo, for every buck that we spent, Canadian industry got $2 worth of contracts. And they were happy with that because they knew they could compete. But there were people like a guy named Alan Williams, who I tangled with a lot, who was a former ADM MAT, who couldn't seem to get his head around that. There was blame on the part of the RCF and the government. They weren't necessarily totally forthcoming the way they should have been, but their focus was on getting the best airplane for the job. And as a fighter pilot, that's what I want. And the F-35 had won every international competition it was in for that reason. The parliamentary budget officer was a big critic of the program, and he wrote a detailed critique of the cost of it. But every single thing in his critique was based on the cost of an airplane based on dollars per pound. Well, that's not how we buy airplanes. And I wrote a critique of his critique that was quite detailed and pointing out the fallacies in there. Of course, needless to say, his critique got more visibility than some dumbass politician's critique. So there you go. The Auditor General also had a big role in the problem that we had. Again, not taking away all the blame from the Air Force, they had some challenges as well. But the original program was $9 billion worth of acquisition, $7 billion for 20 years of support, based on the way programs had been written under the Auditor General's rules before. He changed the rules. He said, well, it can't be just that. You've got to add fuel, salaries, pensions, a whole bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with the day-to-day. Well, it does, but we're not inventing new pilots. We're not inventing new JP4. They're accounted for in this year's budget. They'll be accounted for in next year's budget. It's not new money. But he insisted, and he's the Auditor General, so there you go. So 9 billion plus 7 became 9 plus 16 is 25 billion. Aha, D&D lied. They didn't lie. You asked them a different question. Then he changed the question. He said, okay, it can't be just for 20 years, it's got to be for 42 years. Well, and the bill became 42 billion. Look at that, D&D lied again. No, Auditor General, you asked them another question. I wasn't normally part of that committee, but I was sitting on a committee that was questioning the Auditor General about that stuff, and PMO allowed me to be part of the committee and ask questions. And I was trying to get across to him that, that logic of, they're not lying, you changed the question. And I was going to ask him a question the next time, because PMO had to vet all our questions. Okay, Mr. Auditor General, under your new rules, which you're perfectly entitled to change, what would be the life cycle cost of an entire fleet of warships for 40 years? And of course, the number would be astronomical. And he wouldn't know the number anyway because he hadn't worked it out. But if he did, it would be astronomical. Now, PMO did not allow me to ask that question, so I said, well, there's no point in me being in the committee anymore, so I stopped going. Anyway, we eventually said we're going to buy 65 airplanes. So we made that verbal commitment. And that was the original Liberal number. They said, well, you didn't ask for enough airplanes. Well, no, that was the program we got from the Liberals. Now we're at 88, which is a much better number, should probably be higher. We were offered 4 airplanes off of the USAF line that we wouldn't be able to fly in Canada, but we'd have been in the program with airplanes. They'd have been flying at Eglin Air Force Base, but they'd have had maple leaves on the side. Anyway, I'm a huge, huge fan of Stephen Harper. This isn't political, I'm just a huge fan of his. But he backed off. And we got KPMG involved, and they did an audit. They said, D&D cost estimates are accurate. They should have costed a couple of more things, but what the numbers they gave you were accurate. We also did another evaluation of the contenders and came to the same conclusion as every other competition they'd been in, but it became a little too hot for the government to handle. And we basically, it wasn't part of our 2015 campaign. It just sort of went away, which I was not happy with. The Liberals toyed after that with the idea of buying F-18EFs, and that's where Boeing and Ricardo and others come in as an interim measure. If we bought them, it would not have been interim. we would have bought more of those airplanes and we'd have missed the F-35 entirely. The Liberals reluctantly added the F-35 to the next-gen fighter program as a contender. Along the way, they proceeded to waste $1 billion buying used Australian airplanes to fill a capability gap that arguably did not exist. So we eventually, and here's where Billie's going to take over the rest of the successful side of the story, which took too long. We'll talk about that in another session. Now, the delay may have some benefits. We'll have a more mature airplane, and that's a good thing. But we lost a lot of people along the way, pilots and technicians who got sick and tired of waiting. And that's one of the reasons we have so few pilots and technicians left, is because of that. So they just left. So there were some benefits of a more mature airplane. Canadian industry lost, because while there's Canadian parts in every F-35 out there today, and will be, we had all those initial contracts. We didn't get any follow-on contracts, because why would Lockheed sign a contract in a company in a country that hasn't signed on the line when they've got all kinds of companies in countries that have signed on the line? So a lot of those contracts went elsewhere, and they could have come to Canada. So there was a benefit on one side to the ultimate capability of the airplane. There was a huge loss on the other side to Canadian industry. And we should try to balance those things off, because we're in it for national defense and security. We're also in it for Canadian industry and jobs and Canadians. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Billie, who will talk about the more successful part. Billie.
Thanks, Hawnski. I'm going to draw parallels to 40 years ago when we bought the CF-18. At the beginning of its lifetime, and we lived, and it grew with us as we grew in an Air Force. And I always looked at the same sort of parallel comparison when I came to Canada, because I knew the F-35 would be here in this country, if it got bought, for 40 or 50 years, and we could grow with it along the way. And that's the argument that I played with for 10 years. Let's be really clear. So I'm a guy who grew up in Canada, but as an American test pilot, I worked for Lockheed Martin for 17 years, and I watched the program be overpromised and underdelivered from the beginning. Great, shiny marketing from the very beginning, and stumbled along as soon as the aircraft started to fly. My Patriots and I spent 10 years flying 6 to 7 days a week to get through the formal development of the aircraft, to then get it to a point which you now see out there. 1,061 as of a week ago delivered. 19 Air Forces fly the F-35. There'll be more than 3,000 built, maybe 4,000 in their lifetime. It is the franchise program of this generation, much like the F-16 was in the last generation and the F-4 before that. Ultimately a success story, enormously painful along the way, and just horrible to watch here in Canada. But the parallels to what it can be in this optimistic view really come back to the CF-18. Because we grew as an Air Force, revolutionary for the Canadian Air Force to have a maneuverable airplane like the CF-18 was, and we grew as an Air Force and understood its capability and optimized it over the time, and that's what will happen with the F-35. 88 until 65. By the way, I don't want to take too much over what I'm going to say tonight, so I'll curtail some of this. But instead of $100 million an airplane, $78 million US, by the way, at 1.4 in the exchange rate this morning, but $78 million in the low point of the cost curve. And the deputy commander alerted to it. It's what's called a Block 4 F-35s coming, the first major series of upgrades to the airplane since it was first existed. And had we picked those 4 airplanes that were earmarked for Canada, had Stephen Harper had the courage, we would have fast-tracked into F-35, would have been the spring of 2015, he would have had to commit. But those airplanes, Block 2 and Block 3 airplanes, some of those would not have been able to be upgraded over time because of hardware and software limitations. And we would have been saddled with less than combat-capable airplanes, much like the Australian Air Force is faced with today. And there wouldn't have been enough money to have upgraded them. So in so many ways, trying to look at the optimistic way, I should work for the RCAF as a marketing guy, the optimistic side of this is 88 jets, $78 million, Block 4 jets, all that done. And all the growing pains, and while you've read it in Canadian media, it was like a piranha feeding frenzy over F-35 for so very long because the aircraft didn't work and the systems didn't work. And it took those 10 years to mature the systems. But all that stuff is done. And when the RCF gets their first jets in the summer of in 2026, These are full-up airplanes, and all the hard lessons have been learned, and all the pain has been shouldered by the other air forces. And the tactics of fifth generation, which is wildly complex and completely different than anything that us as career aviators ever did, has all been matured and developed. And the only thing Canadian pilots have to do is hit the easy button, like going into a Staples store, and learn from everyone else. So there really are benefits to it all. And this Air Force will grow through its time with an amazingly lethal, very un-Canadian word, a lethal, effective, and survivable airplane as a product of all that. So we stumbled into success, right? It was wildly embarrassing to be the lone kid. I've always been tagged as the Canadian in the room. The socialist state of Canada milking the program and the industrial benefits across the border with absolutely no commitment to buy the airplane. And the patience at Lockheed Martin and the US government was incredibly whisper thin by the end of it, ready to cut Canada out of the program and pass on those industrial opportunities that are a generational in length and money, and ready to walk away from Canada because there was no commitment. And there's zero patience across the border for the Canadian politics that went back and forth as Justin Trudeau played us everyone for fools, and we stumbled there. Look, there's lots of dirt to go around. I know the Swedish Saab company very well, even though we compete out in the public forum. They're some of my best personal and professional friends. And they received assurances from high up in the Liberal government that they actually had a chance in this competition, just to keep them alive and have them funneling in the money to keep in the competition, that they never had a chance. And our Boeing friends worked really, really hard to backdoor into this program. When I look at it all now, what's coming, and there are personnel issues to get enough people to manage this, and a transformational, well, a tsunami of change coming to the armed forces and the Air Force. But what is coming is more lethal than any one of us could ever have imagined, ever. I flew the jet for 10 years, and it still blows my mind to understand how lethal a human is in this jet, because it is so amazingly capable. When we talk about the Arctic and exploitation that is guaranteed to happen as climate change accelerates access to our very valuable natural resources, that's the kind of weapon system to allow us to protect our sovereignty going forward. And clearly, Vladimir Putin has told us there's a real world threat out there. So we stumbled into success. There's an optimistic way to look how we fell out of this. We lost 10 years of development for the armed forces. The whole fighter pilot training system collapsed in that decade and will take time to rebuild and ultimately get back to where it was. But in the end, magically, we made the right move, buying the right jet and the right numbers. Thanks.
I just have a 30-second addendum to that. My last trip, I was an honorary colonel at the time. My last trip in an F-18 was in January 2017 in Tyndall Air Force Base with 401 Squadron. It was a 12v12. There were, on our side, there were F-18s, F-16s, Alpha jets. On their side, there were 12 F-35s / F-16s. And the guy I was with let me fly the little trip, which was really cool. We died multiple times. It wasn't a close-in fight. It was a radar fight at distance. We died multiple times from people we had no idea they were there, because they were F-35s and we couldn't see them. So whatever Billie said, amplify that.
Thank you. So, as promised, I'm going to stop for questions. One question, and then we're going to move on to the next thing, but is there a question from the floor?
For any of you 104 pilots, I've been an airplane nut since I was born. I was always, people came up to me and said, you know, those F-104s, all they are is widowmakers. They kill people. They're no good. And a comment from any one of you, I told people, if you wanted to fly straight and level in nice clear sky, Air Canada is looking for people. If you want to fly real airplanes, real time, fly 104s in Europe. Any comments?
Anybody who called the airplane a widowmaker had never flown it. and had never talked to people who have flown it. I don't know a single starfighter pilot of any nationality who ever called it that. Respect the airplane like any airplane, and it will treat you honestly. Disrespect it, and you will kill yourself. The airplane was not a widowmaker at all. There's a complete, it's always ranked. Whenever I see that on Facebook, I just can't resist chiming in saying, but you're right.
Thank you, Laurie. So we'll move on to the next section here, and it's about defense expenditure and how fast Canada should move to 2% of our GDP in defense expenditure. And Hawnski's going to take the lead on this.
Okay, and we'll try to be expeditious. Okay, I'll quit now. And if defense spending has grown in Canada, it's about, I don't know, 37, 38 million since 1960, when it was much smaller. The GDP percentage in 1960 was about 4%. Today it's about less than 1.5%. We're one of only 9 NATO countries not meeting our 2% commitment, which we committed to in 2014. And as we've heard, there's uncertainty and instability around the world. Can we contribute to combating that? Closer to home, we have serious security issues in the Arctic, which we're going to talk about on another section. We have a rules-based international order, or do we? We need security to have prosperity, and that was mentioned earlier. You know, we've become marginalized and lost respect and credibility due to our chronic underfunding. And this is not a comment on anybody serving. They are the best. But our allies don't trust us or respect us, and our enemies don't fear us. And that's not a good combination. David Berkison was part of about an hour-and-a-half long critique of how the government has deserted the armed forces, and it's worth watching. Various alarms are going off around the country, from the Business Council of Canada, General Eyre, as he was retiring, Vice Admiral Angus Topshee, the CSIS Director, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Perrin Beattie, various ambassadors, and many more, and now including Donald Trump. The PBO, Yves Giroux, said we have to increase our funding to $82 billion to reach 2%, and that's a pretty big bite. The question is, you know, what are our national interests as a middle power? Are we actually a middle power? We need to articulate and prioritize what and who we are trying to be, because I don't think we know. And it's going to take some consistent and courageous leadership across successive governments to make that happen. We need deeds and not words, as outlined in a paper that was published by CGAI. You know, a solid 2% commitment could be a forcing function for multiple departments of government to concentrate on actual defense capabilities to meet that target. So how do we get to 2% and beyond? It can't be a one-time thing. It's got to be continuous, and it must be spend and not budget talking points. It must be actual defense spending and not padding things like pensions and so on to try to make it look better. Is 2% a ceiling or a floor? I would suggest that it better be a floor. We need to re-equip, and that means fixing a procurement system that has become sclerotic and constipated. There is no perfect program. The F-18 was about as perfect a program as you're going to find. Now, there's some good news for the Air Force with airplanes like the P-8 and the A330. The Kingfisher for search and rescue is not a success story. But people will always be the long pole in the tent. We simply don't have enough. We're not retaining enough of what we have, and we're not recruiting and training enough new ones. We should look at the United States Marine Corps as a model for recruiting. They send their best to recruiting billets with the promise of a desired posting after 2 years of demonstrated results. We don't do that. You know, we take, who's old, what are we going to do with old Bloggins there? Well, let's send them off recruiting. And that's not the way to get the best. You got to send the best to get the best. The Marine Corps does that, and they do it extremely well. We don't. With a secure source of funding, reinvestment in infrastructure, housing, training is all possible, and better treatment of our members and their families, particularly their families, will go a long way to getting us to 2%. You know, simply doubling everybody's pay would get us closer to 2%. That might not play well with everyone. You know, we're here about the Air Force, but the Army and the Navy are in the same boat, so to speak. Currently, we're at 71,000 mandated regular and 30,000 reserves. We're not there. We're 16,000-ish or more short. Growing the force to 130,000 regular and 30,000 reserves would be a long way to forcing us to get to 2%. That's easy to say, obviously, and tough to do. But the real long pole in the tent is Canadians writ large. Canadian priorities are not in security and defense because they don't perceive a threat because we've never been directly threatened. Maybe when the Chinese land at the northern end of Baffin Island and start drilling, they'll get the message. But it'll be too late. You know, 1939, we had time. But big war may be coming again, and we do not have time. So the pressure's only going to ramp up after the US election, and it deserves to ramp up. But again, until Canadians care about this, governments won't care. That's the way it works. How do we make Canadians care? By getting out and talking, by organizations like CGAI and others, laying things down and saying, look, folks, here's some numbers, here's some threats. I mean, just pay a bit of attention to what's happening, you know, with Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. We're under threat, Canadians, and we collectively better pay attention. So that's my 2 cents. I'll pass it on to whoever wants to add to that. Oh, come on. I couldn't have got it right. That's not what you tell me all the time. Okay.
Just one comment. You mentioned $80 billion that we'd have to get to. If you take the current expenditures by the United States military, I believe they're about $800 billion. So 80 billion will get us to the 10% number that we normally think of Canada, Canadians versus the US. There's another marker pointing at that 80 billion. So.
Anything else? Okay, great. Thank you. The last prepared subject, if you will, as much as we prepare, is about moving our fighter leader in training offshore. Like, what's up with that? Gord?
I think it's been pretty well covered, but I'll just give one example that might offer a little more knowledge about it. As I've said, I was involved with a nuclear strike role back in the 60s and the early 70s. And to do the nuclear strike role and the reconnaissance role, we had the same time. It was all single plane missions. Go out by yourself, alone and unafraid. At least unafraid most of the time. So because of that, during that time frame, we lost the ability to execute multi-plane missions. So other than practice bombing missions to the range, that was the only multi-plane missions that we did. Now, I was posted back to the training, the 104 training unit in Cold Lake in 1970, and we were faced with the end of the nuclear mission, and all of a sudden we had to teach the pilots multi-plane missions, mostly air to ground, but we also did some air-to-air work as well. The point I'm trying to make is that it's easy to lose, but it took us a long time to get that ability to do multi-plane missions back into our Air Force. And I'm just concerned about with the FLIT training going south, even with a training such as that, when we try and get it back and get it back in vogue so we can train with the Canadian pilots, it may take quite a while to do it. So, but as I said, the subject's been pretty well covered up to this point.
Thank you, Gord. Billy?
Yeah, I'll jump into that. I flew fighters for 40 years, and 23 years of those were south of the border. And every year I would have a check ride by the United States Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy. So I relate that because a significant part of my career was in that system. The United States Air Force has to produce 1,500 pilots per year. To date, they produce annually about 1,300. It's a very generic cookie cutter system because they're building pilots for the bomber fleet, different types of fighters, and everyone has to be the same. It's a very hierarchical Air Force and driven, it's really driven by rules. And you really can't allow an Air Force that big to have pilots think on their own. So a generic cookie cutter system works, and the pilots that come out of there are safe. But what they're not is adaptive, and they're not agile, because they're entering a system where you're really not allowed to think on your own. You're going to do exactly as you were told. And that works for that Air Force, and it works for some of the other Air Force, but here's why it doesn't work in Canada. We're far too small to have a million people above us tell us exactly what to do. And we have prided ourselves over the so many years of building pilots that could think on their own, be adaptive, assume responsibility, be decision makers. And when they went too far, and every one of us were lieutenants or captains and got ourselves in trouble, there'd be a long leash that'd be yanked and pull us back in. We'd be mentored or slapped in the wrist and then sent back out again. And we would learn from those mistakes. But the ultimate product shouldered more responsibility and more authority than could ever have been expected from the massive Air Force south of the border. And it has become convenient to now let a massive contract for, it is something like 10 years, to the Air Education and Training Command to have a Canadian component down there, a significant Canadian component, and that's where Canadian fighter pilots are going to go. And the end product will come back, and they'll be safe, but they won't be Canadianized. And they'll come back to our training system in the near term. It'll be 410 Squadron in Cold Lake on the F-18, but ultimately it'll be to the F-35. And we will have to bring them home and Canadianize them and teach them to think on their own again. Because we're going to empower them and send them off again in harm's way without all the support system that the big Air Force has. That detriment, and part of it's a fault of the F-35 delay and saga, where the fighter pilot training system, which was meant to be bolstered, just kind of collapsed over the time. And it's not entirely accurate. With all deference to the deputy minister, there are, 16 Hawks that were towed from the Collingwood Civilian Airport to CFB Borden to be maintenance trainer when they still had 5 to 10 years left in their lives. But we gave it all up. And we gave it all up again, really the product of the delay of the F-35. So, for 10 years, we're going to get products of a generic cookie cutter system, come back to Canada, and then have to teach them that Canadian way of thinking, of being agile, adaptable, of assuming responsibility at a very young rank level, to then fly the airplanes and do the missions we have. And it'll cost us. Now, I know we're very, very proud to be Canadians, and for a bunch of you, it means nothing. And I've always searched for an apples to apples comparison. Because most Canadian pilots finish their time as fighter pilots and they go to Air Canada, or go to WestJet, or they go to be real estate brokers, or they go to law school or somewhere else. And it's really hard to compare how good they really are. And we love bragging at the bar the same as anyone else and telling everyone else how good we are. But I do have an apples to apples comparison. Because in the test pilot world, there's a disproportionate number of Canadians out in the big game, which tells me really how good we are. Of 10 Lockheed Martin F-35 test pilots, the single choicest test pilot program in a generation, 2 were Canadian. At the Boeing company, the senior test pilot of their biggest program for 15 years, the Super Order program, is the gentleman we mentioned earlier, Ricardo Traven. At every major aircraft manufacturer in North America, there are Canadians throughout that system, Canadian test pilots. And you tell me why they're beating out Marine Corps, Navy, or Air Force Americans, where they're beating out Brits or Aussies or Italians, or pick any other nation. It's because they had that unique skill and talent fostered over the years in a system that gave them responsibility far younger in life than in any other Air Force. And the end product is that they were so valued out in the real world. And it has been my apples to apples comparison of just how good our pilot training system is or was, and perhaps someday will be again, but we're going to hurt for a while. And at $78 million times 1.4 in the American dollar, at $110 million a copy, the caliber of those pilots is really going to matter when we bring them home and they don't have the great umbrella of the US Air Force anymore. So we may yet feel the cost of all of that.
I'm going to pick up on that just a little bit, and it goes back to what we were saying before about the number of people we have and the training capacity that we've lost, because the training capacity is in the people that we have or had. Had a conversation with the commander of one Canadian Air Division a few days ago, and at one point we were supposed to have about 150 fighter pilots in the Canadian Air Force. At one point we were down to 44. Now, talking to the commander, General, name I lost? No, McKenna, thank you. Chris McKenna, he said, no, we're up to about 65. I said, great. So we're only 55% short instead of 70% short. Well, that is progress. But he said, what we have, a lot of those guys are the long in the tooth, half colonels or whatever, they're there, or the really, really young guys. What they're missing is that whole central cadre of the experienced captain, major. We haven't run a fighter weapons instructors course for years, and that's where we inculcate some of that expertise that Billie was talking about, refine it to the point where we can lead. We were leading, and Billie was there, he was doing it. We were leading mass multinational missions in Kosovo and Libya. We can't do that. We don't have those people anymore. And it's going to take us 10 years to get back there if we start today. And we need to start today because, you know, to be a bit bragging about Canadians, and as Billie mentioned, they need us. And we were producing them. We haven't for a long time. We need to start producing that again. And as Billie said, this whole thing has taken us down. We can get back up. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some capital L leadership, politically and militarily. We've done it before. We can do it again with the help of folks like you in this room. So let's get her done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're all ready for the Senior Reserve Fighter Pilot Reserve Squadron. So we're in a learning institute here, and I just want to make a point. It's an institute where it fosters deep learning. The type of learning that Bobby was talking about as a fighter pilot, it has to be deep, but more importantly, it has to be fast. And if you don't learn fast enough, you don't get ahead of the risks that inevitably confront you in that mission when you're the only one in the airplane. And if you don't get ahead of them, they reach out and they bite you. And sometimes you can make it, and sometimes you can't. So what you see here are an array of the fastest learning people I've ever met. Thank you very much for your attention and for your active participation. It's been a blast.